Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bloomberg Government webinar, Win Your Next Defense Opportunity with Seaport Next Generation, presented in conjunction with Unanet. My name is Chris Jezior, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Government Contracting here at Bloomberg Government, and I am so excited that you could join us today. We've got some great material to share with you. Before we jump into the content, I have just a few housekeeping announcements. First, we've scheduled the webinar for about an hour, and I expect we will use most of that time, but we will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. Into my second item, which is questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab there on the right side of your screen. Third, we are also recording this webinar for later playback. You can expect to receive a link to the archived version once it's uploaded to our website. Finally, the slides. Bloomberg Government clients will have access to the slides shortly after the webinar concludes. They'll be posted to the BGov exclusive section this afternoon, and I'll include a link to them in the follow-up email. If you're not a Bloomberg Government client, we'd love to give you a demonstration of our product. BGov provides data-driven decision tools, news, and analytics that help shape business strategy, execution, and pipeline. We make it easier to understand the federal market and competitive landscape. Request a demo at bgov.com. With that, I'll pass it over to our presenters. Dan, the floor is all yours.
Hello and good afternoon. First and foremost, I would certainly like to thank everyone for taking some time out of their day to examine some of the analysis that we will present to you regarding Seaport-E and Seaport-NxG. We're certainly at a pivotal juncture as we transition from the predecessor contract and look at some of the new ways the Navy will be purchasing through Seaport Next Generation. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dan Snyder, and I am the Director of Government Contracts here at Bloomberg Government. I am joined with my co-presenter today, Rob Levinson, who is our Senior Defense Analyst. Also joining us on the presentation today is Unanet's Senior Vice President of Marketing, Richard Hayden. As Chris mentioned, certainly if you have any questions as we're presenting any of this information, we strongly encourage you to submit those via the chat function, and we will try our very best to get to as many as possible in the remaining balance of the presentation. A quick overview of the contents that Rob and I will be focusing on predominantly today. And we don't have to, we'll elaborate on each of the subcategories, but from a high-level overview, we wanted to extract some of the spending trends that we are able to derive from Seaport-E as an indicator of what we expect here at Bloomberg Government to continue on Next Generation. From there, we are going to also take a look at some of the small business spending aspects, and then we'll conclude with the activity to date that we have seen so far on Seaport-NxG, as well as talk briefly about some of the on-ramp activity that despite its infancy, the Seaport has already announced will take place in the second quarter of fiscal 2021.
Okay, so this is sort of the big overview and probably why we're having this webinar, right? Seaport-E is the single largest contract in the Department of Defense. Now, people sometimes are surprised by that. Of course, you've got programs like an F-35, but the F-35 is actual multiple contracts that are competed every once in a while, renegotiated for every new lot of the aircraft. So yeah, that's close to $400 billion when all is said and done. But Seaport-E has been one contract. Here we show on the slide the data from 2004. The contract actually started in 2001, but the first 3 years it wasn't that much money, so it doesn't show up on the graph. So we started with 2004. But you can see it's over about $65 billion since inception. And you see since about 2009, 2010, it's averaged right around $5 billion a year. And we certainly expect that it will continue, and Seaport Next Gen will probably have a similar pattern, similar amount of money. I just always point out, and it's true for every time you see on the slide in the 2019 figure is year to date. DoD delays their contracting data by 90 days for security reasons. So, any figure that we have for 2019 is still lagged by a few months. We really won't complete 2019 we don't have the complete data until about January. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that spending is so much lower for 2019. Just we haven't finished out the fiscal year and the data for that year. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Dan.
Rob, just one point here. I do think this illustrates, it's certainly not a coincidence that we started with this slide overall. Generally, you can expect consistency of about $5 billion flowing through Seaport as a contract vehicle. We did see relative levels below that between 15 and 17, and then it shot back up to $5.4 billion in fiscal 2018. Now, that is in lockstep with some of the overall increases that we have seen government-wide. And from 17 to fiscal year 18, there was a jump of about $30 billion. So a lot of that could be concentrated in professional services spending overall. But certainly this vehicle is in a class of its own in terms of the longevity that it has been able to sustain at these spending levels and the amount of business that it has performed. Before we get in to the details for Seaport-E specifically, we wanted to counter the previous slide with a perspective about how the government will be spending its nearly $80 billion that are obligated on an annual basis. Now that $80 billion in professional services is $80 billion of the $560 billion that was obligated government-wide in fiscal 2018. Professional services on its own, of all the categories and market classifications analyzed, represents the single most obligations and categories of spending government-wide. Given this importance, we wanted to certainly put into perspective how Seaport-E interacts with some of its competitor contracts, such as OASIS and RS3 and professional services schedule at the General Services Administration. If we could highlight one very important element on this chart overall, it's that these five contracts, four if you combine OASIS and OASIS Small Business, are certainly expected to absorb the vast majority of that $80 billion in professional services spending that will continue to be obligated by the federal government. One thing that we would point out as well is how we've seen an escalation from fiscal 2015 and how that picture looks very drastically different now that we are arriving in 2019 and soon to be fiscal 2020. So certainly given the spending levels that we see illustrated in this chart, we're seeing a large impact from OASIS and OASIS Small Business. Seaport is expected to maintain its level of about $5 billion. Professional services is generally accountable for between $5 and $6 billion as well. And then we would anticipate a large majority of the Army's RS3 to also have a significant impact on professional services moving forward. What is not featured in this chart is spending on the predecessor contracts for RS3. If we were to account for those contracts, RS3, when it was awarded in fiscal 2017, combined 5 separate contracts that were managed by the Army, the largest of which were S3 and R2 3G. And if we account for those two spending levels, in addition to the $18 billion we see in fiscal 2018 here, that would add an additional $1.2 billion. So certainly these 5 vehicles will continue to dominate professional services spending and should be taken into consideration when you're analyzing and considering a bid on Seaport-NxG task orders. This next contract here, chart here, shows the top professional services vehicles in the government overall. The largest, as we saw represented on the last chart there, is professional services, Seaport, OASIS, and then that is followed by AMCOM EXPRESS. Some of the contracts that I did mention as the predecessor, you will notice R23G is listed in the top 10, as well as some residual spending from an information technology contract such as Alliant. But overall, the top 20 contracts represent about $4 billion in spending in fiscal 2018. If we analyze the period going back to fiscal 2015, we're looking at about $16.5 billion that has been performed exclusively on the top 20 contracts alone. One point that is worth mentioning as well, in terms of the landscape for professional services multiple award contracts, is GSA's professional services schedule and the consolidation effort that they sustained in 2015. You'll notice that is now number 1 as a result of that consolidation effort. If we exclude that consolidation of 8 existing contracts into one, Seaport-E would be at the top of the list for all professional services contracts in the federal government.
All right, so this slide now shows the breakdown of the companies that are getting the big Seaport dollars. Not a huge amount of surprises here. These are obviously big companies, SAIC, General Dynamics, Booz Allen, and AECOM. We'll get into more of the small business aspects here in a second, but this you can see, and SAIC has been at the top again. This is the total beginning in fiscal 2015 through 2019 year to date, and of course, far and away the top PSC code that this work falls into, as no surprise, is professional support services on the engineering and technical side. And again, I don't think that we expect a much of a shift with Next Gen. We'll probably see these same folks playing and winning a lot of the work, but we'll talk about small business and the subcontracting opportunities as well as we move on here.
I think that's exactly right, Rob. Many of these large businesses have performed successful back since the inception of 2004, and by all indications should have pretty good representation on SeaPort-NxG.
And let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the company rankings, both large and small business. So you can see what we had on the left. Again, the big ones dominate, but it's interesting to point out, if you look at the top company on the right, we'll see as we go forward that they're about number, I think, 8 overall. Actually, that's, I think, on our next slide that we show that. But the big thing, and Dan and I will talk about this throughout the briefing, and I think this is one of the unique characteristics of Seaport, is how much is available for small business and how well small business has done at competing for the work. You can see the value totals are very strong, lots of different small businesses participating. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, here's what I wanted to point out. So if you look at the top small business is that Alaska Native Corporation. I'm not sure I want to attempt the pronunciation of the name. It's a little bit difficult, but they're number 8 overall in the overall rankings. In 2018, and they have been doing well. They were 10 and 12 in the previous couple of years, so they're up there again. Just emphasizing that while big boys like Booz Allen and SAIC are certainly up there at the top, there is a lot of opportunity for small business here. And again, we expect that with Next Gen, that will be true as well. We don't expect a big shift, continued emphasis on small business opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. It's really, if we're thinking about a multiple award contract of this magnitude, it's not generally the case that the small businesses on their own merits would appear in the top 20 with many of the large businesses. But Seaport, given all of the services that it provides is really an anomaly to that principle. If we look at the large and small businesses we saw on the last chart, that top 20 has accounted for $10.3 billion, and the top 20 small businesses accounted for $3 billion. So more of a disparity if we're looking at the class of spending between the two sides, but certainly a lot of potential if you can perform professional services well as a small business to find yourself on this list with the large businesses and competing against orders against the Booz, SAIC, General Dynamics as a small business.
This is just sort of another illustration which really sort of drives home the point. So you're looking at the small business versus other than small business. We say other than small business just because that's the way the data is characterized, and then other and small business does include some universities and nonprofits as well. But you can see that 44% of the dollars, on average for this period of time for 2015 is going to small business. And again, as Dan pointed out, that's really unusual for these kind of big maps to see that the bigs and the smalls are competing on a pretty level playing field. And small business has really got great opportunities. Again, not seen on lots of other of these big types of contracts that Dan has talked about earlier. But again, this is our foot stomping point. I think is if you're a small business in the professional services space, Seaport is definitely something that's very attractive for you.
Yeah, Chad, we take a look very intricately at Bloomberg Government at multiple award contract spending, and a component of that is how small businesses are faring on multiple award contracts as a whole. So if we take this in perspective, the benchmark that the government establishes is about 23% that they would like to see going to small businesses as a whole. In Bloomberg Government's multiple award contract analysis, we determined that about 37 or 38% goes to small businesses of the $132 billion spent on multiple award contracts in a given year. So if we look at these numbers at Seaport-E, they are blowing out of the water both the government's benchmark of 23%, the average that goes to small businesses as a whole, which is about 38%, or $49 billion of $132 billion in the overall MAC portfolio, and nearly half of those awards on Seaport-E are going to small businesses. So certainly an attractive vehicle. I think given the volume of contractors, certainly plays to its advantage. But about half of the dollars is a tremendous achievement by the Army to be able to Navy, to disperse 44% to small businesses.
This is another critical one, which just shows another big surprise, I think, again, compared to others, is how much of the small business stuff is not through set-asides, but full and open competition. Now, there may be some under-reporting on some of this because of some anomalies in the way the data is reported, but still you can see that the vast majority of the $5.5 billion that goes to small businesses there was not used as a set-aside. And then you can see the categories over on the right: veteran-owned, woman-owned, 8A, etc. Again, just showing how level the playing field here is really for small business on Seaport-E.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. So this is really the second chapter in the small business detail that the data is showing us as a whole. Just to clarify a point about the data, on the left-hand side, the set-aside type generally is going to refer to the solicitation procedure. So as Rob pointed out, that is generally applied to the solicitation, or in this case, the RFQ. So there may not be complete exposure to the amount of set-asides that are occurring through Seaport-E, But in terms of using the data and deciphering what is directionally accurate, this would indicate that small businesses are winning a tremendous amount of orders on their own merits. They're competing against the large businesses, and they're winning outright. So they're not relying on the set-asides that are typically released on a full and open or set-aside basis on Fed Biz Ops. This is a tremendous advantage. A lot of the clients Bloomberg Government has worked with continues to emphasize the challenge about growing from small to large, or small to medium even. And one of those challenges and most significant hurdles that is difficult to overcome is winning work as a small business through full and open competition. So certainly one of the vehicles that has a demonstrable impact on achieving that objective would be a slot on SeaPort-NxG. And as we see on the right-hand side, how those small businesses pan out. The veteran-owned are winning the vast majority of those, followed by women-owned 8A, and then some small obligations are also being dispersed to Alaskan Native as well as Hub Zone. This next slide here we won't spend a tremendous amount of time on, but we decided that it was worth including based off the sole fact of the amount of obligations that are concentrated in and around the Beltway itself. So far and away, the vast majority of spending obligations that are flowing through Seaport are concentrated in the state of Virginia. So a lot of those obligations are tied to activity at the Pentagon, as well as down south at areas such as Norfolk, and then Maryland, with some of its bases at Fort Meade, likely have a strong impact on contractors' ability to perform well. And then the third one, California, which has a tremendous amount of Navy and program management support in the city of San Diego, rounds out the top three. The next slide here goes down a level. So all of the funding obligations are certainly concentrated heavily at the agency level at the Navy. If we go down a step and see who among the bureaus are participating most heavily, we get a better picture of how activity is performing. Overall, NAVSEA, who is responsible for managing Seaport, is far and away the top performer year over year on Seaport. They are accountable for nearly half, $2.5 billion of that $5 billion that we saw on the introduction is accountable to NAVSEA. The second bureau that we're going to take a little bit more of a deeper dive look at on the next slide is NAVAIR. And to date, they have accounted for $1 billion of the $5 billion flowing through Seaport on a year-over-year basis. NAVAIR is followed by NAVWAR, and then the Marine Corps, as well as the Secretary of the Navy, also rounding out the top five. But overall, as a general trend, we're expecting the majority of these organizations to remain the primary users. And then as we transition to the next slide here, we'll take a closer look at why NAVAIR is a little bit different than the rest of the field. So this is one of my favorite charts on the whole presentation. Of course, some of the bid information that we will look at towards the conclusion of the presentation and getting into some of the exciting aspects about how we can expect task order activity to roll out and how to bid on the on-ramp is exciting as well. But I really appreciate the storyline that NAVAIR itself is representing based on some of the data analysis that Bloomberg Government has performed. So if we consider NAVAIR, they are an anomaly because they kind of bucked the trend back when NAVSEA was competing and establishing SeaPort-NxG. Instead of committing to leverage the majority of their professional services orders through the follow-on vehicle, they established a plan whereby they would have an interplay where they would rely on complex professional services through OASIS, and then to counter some of the small business pitfalls that may have occurred on OASIS, they established their own multiple award contract known as Program Management Contractor Support Services. So OASIS has been in existence since about 2015 and was well established by the time NAVAIR established this plan. The Program Management Contractor Support Services multiple award contract was recently awarded to all small businesses and contains 23 or so slots on that vehicle right now. But the biggest surprise that we are seeing in the data analysis of this agency and how they're obligating some of their professional services orders is that despite their plan to shift from Seaport to OASIS and PMCSS, Seaport-E is remaining to be the top professional services multiple award contract at NAVAIR. Now, certainly as we see highlighted in fiscal 2018 and 2019, it's having a marginal impact and more orders are shifting to OASIS Small Business, and PMCSS. But it's not as much of as a footprint as I guess I would have imagined given the stake that NAVAIR put in the ground back when they announced this plan in about 2017 or so. So this is one of the trends that we at Bloomberg Government will continue to monitor most closely as we examine how activity on SeaPort-NxG and where future orders are going to flow. But generally what I would advise, the biggest takeaway from here is that the decision makers at NAVAIR may not be completely on board with some of the activity that was struck down with the mandate and may have a preference towards continuing use, at least in some capacity, through SeaPort-NxG. Okay, the next few slides here are going to examine, some of the task order activity that we have seen, and then we're going to take a brief moment on a few slides here to then talk about the Seaport Next Generation bid as well. So overall, this analysis was meant to provide a long-term view of how clients might expect to bid and win on upcoming Seaport task orders. One of the common challenges that we at Bloomberg Government often hear is that clients are trying to get left of the RFP. They want insights into requirements that are going to be competed 12 to 18 months out. And one of the most common solutions that you can apply to achieve that is looking at the expiring work on a vehicle such as Seaport-E to determine what will be competed on NxG. Now, a lot of times, given the requirements under the vehicles, that may not work in a straight line, but generally, the financial services components, the program management components, the IT and ancillary services that we see going through Seaport-E are stuff that the government needs on a pretty consistent basis after a 5-year or 3-year period of performance expires on a given task order. So overall, Bloomberg Government looked at the expiring task orders that are expected to occur within the next 5 fiscal year. So in terms of volume, not surprisingly, the next 2 fiscal years will host the majority of those orders. with about 469 totaling nearly $8 billion in the next fiscal year starting October 1. And then it drops off slightly by a little over 100 to 335 orders that are expected to be competed in fiscal 2021, which are have a total value of about $7 billion overall. So if we were to provide a use case for this, one of the examples that I would suggest could be applied towards identifying orders within your core competencies are to set your parameters by that order expiration date, and then refining which ones may be most attractive by fiscal year. So if you're a company that provides program management support, you could identify that keyword search within those 469 orders set to expire in fiscal 2020 to get a reasonable determination about what you can expect to flow through NxG as we transition to the new vehicle. Next slide.
Okay, this sort of drills even a little further down from what Dan was just talking about. These were just some samples of opportunities we pulled probably a couple of weeks ago now when we were starting to build this out. These were within the next 12 months, some big task orders that are expiring on Seaport-E, and we would expect that most of these would transition to Seaport-NxG, with the exception of, the one there, the fourth one on the list, the Technical Engineering Services in Support of the National Capital Region. Because that's NAVAIR, as Dan mentioned, NAVAIR may try and look to OASIS to move some of that work or all of that work when that comes up, when that expires. But the other ones, again, these are the types of work we expect: ship design services, training, those sorts of things, business solutions, program management. These are very typical kinds of things that are awarded on Seaport. And again, through our opportunities tool, you can look at the expiring task orders out and figure out that, it's very likely that for these types of services, there's going to be recompetes and new opportunities. So lots coming up in the next 12 months. Again, expecting that these will transition from Seaport-E onto Seaport-NxG in some fashion.
That's a great point, Rob. So this more explanatory detail is meant to plot how you could strategically align your interests in bid and proposal resources for a given bid. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, we have selected the highest value orders. But if you're a small business, you can also manipulate the total order value to something that may be a little bit more digestible for your organization. So if you're targeting bids in the $50 to $75 million, we would suggest looking at your core competencies, looking at the bureaus, looking at what you might reasonably be able to bid on, to then come up with a capture plan as far as fiscal 2020 and fiscal 2021 could be concerned. The next slide here is illustrating some of the activity that we have seen on Seaport Next Generation to date so far. Now, one point that I will make about this is I am somewhat surprised there isn't more activity that has been reported to date so far, given that it was awarded back in December 2018. So Bloomberg Government relies on FPDS for its reporting, and a lot of these orders that we saw coming in had a transaction sign date as far back as May or so. So it could very easily be a result of the 90-day Defense Department delay, and we could see an influx of activity being reported across the board as we move into the next few months and close out fiscal 2019 overall. But as it stands, this data represents what is publicly available as of yesterday. So we cross-referenced all of our results regarding information that is publicly reported as of September 10. And those results surface 8 orders totaling $15 million that have been reported on Next Generation to date. And I tried to highlight and as you can see in the bold, in the sub-bullets there, the types of services that are flowing through it. And to no surprise, there's really a slew of variety of professional services activity that's going through Seaport Next Generation already. You can see we've got program management and help desk support. We've got construction management. We've got service-oriented architecture, as well as financial management services. So the one thing that I would say this also illustrates is just the spectrum of activity that contractors continue to rely on Seaport to deliver. The largest order I will point out is our top contractor there, Booz Allen, is off to the running already. They won the largest total value order, which was $168 million for the Program Executive Office for Enterprise Information Systems out at Spayward in San Diego. This next slide, we just wanted to, before we get into some of the bid details, and discuss briefly the on-ramp activity that the Navy is planning and announced in late late July. But before we do, we just wanted to highlight a few of the key transitional changes that are between Seaport-E and Seaport-NxG overall. So, in terms of zones, we're remaining about the same at about from 7 on the predecessor to no zones overall on the follow-on. For functional categories, we've gone from 22 to just 2. So those 2 functional categories include engineering support services and program management support services. So we've gone from 22 in the orders that were competed to 2. Ordering offices have also been reduced. So if you're looking to do business with your agency customer, that's going to be marginalized and reduced by about 50. In terms of NAICS codes, despite a representation and elimination of 2, by and large, there's only been one that has been reported, 541330 for engineering services across the board. One of the key differences that was also brought to the forefront was the on-ramps. As many people are probably familiar with, the rolling admissions was set to take place at a fixed time. I think it was about April when Seaport-E facilitated their competition. And instead of having that fixed term, the Navy is now calling on-ramps as they so determine suitable for their best interest. And then in terms of off-ramps, we saw no activity that occurred on Seaport-E, and they are saying that if you don't have orders or any activity on NxG, that could make you susceptible towards being eliminated from participation. Next slide. Okay, so we have several bullets in terms of preparing for an on-ramp bid. As I noted in my previous comments, that the NAVSEA intends to issue an on-ramp and open the existing solicitation in the second quarter of fiscal 2021. That was according to a July 2019 announcement. So one of the biggest surprises, I suppose, is that despite the limited activity, as we saw 8 orders totaling $15 million, the Navy is really looking far in advance about when they're opening up an on-ramp, and has already, I will compliment them to that they've done it so far in advance and given companies a tremendous amount of time to prepare. Now, what do you need in order to qualify for an NxG bid? By statute, there is no cardinal change, or what's referred to as a cardinal change, that can be applied to the proposal evaluation. Now, that means the original evaluation outlined in Section M of the RFP must remain the same so that companies who won a slot originally do not have any competitive advantage or disadvantage. And really, what this slide boils down to is there remains one single evaluation factor that the Navy is interested in, and that remains work that, quote-unquote, is in direct support of the Navy. Now, how is the Navy defining that direct support? That means business with the Navy in the last 5 years, supporting naval activity. So that could include subcontracting. That could include a $2,000 order. That could include a $5 million order. It doesn't matter. If you have any direct support with the Navy, that would warrant your inclusion and a spot in the upcoming on-ramp. So my suggestion, and last thing before we pivot to the next slide, would be if you are a company that does not possess Navy experience, as we said, there's a tremendous amount of time, 15 months, to try to win Navy work that is supporting the Navy, and that should qualify you for a bid. In the first round of bidding, we saw that 99% of companies that submitted a bid received a bid. So only about 15 contractors did not receive a bid overall.
I think it's important, Dan, to note, I mean, that really says the Navy's looking for a low barrier to entry here. They want to get as many companies on this thing as they want so that there's lots of competition. They're not looking to exclude people. You know, you meet these minimum requirements, you got 15 months to go find work for the Navy. It's not that hard to get on it. And again, the Navy just wants a broad range of companies then that can compete for all of this work.
Okay, the next portion in the two slides, we wanted to make a note about subcontracting and how that is going to play out in SeaPort-NxG. So the plan that the agency has set forth is at least 20% of the total planned subcontract dollars under the contract. Now, in the conversations that I've had with the government contracting community, subcontract plans are not, will I say, always taken seriously because there is no statutory requirement for the prime contractor to abide by these rules. But what we're going to see on the next chart is Seaport, again, is an anomaly in that there is a tremendous amount of subcontracting going through this contract as it stands right now. If you are looking to participate and do not have any Navy work currently, working as a subcontractor is certainly something that could be in your best interest. Given the 20% that prime contractors must maintain, you could approach them, outline these details, regardless of your socioeconomic designations, whether it be hub zone, SDVOB, women-owned. There really is some eligibility for you to compete and participate as a subcontractor with an existing large through Seaport-NxG. So just how much subcontracting has been performed on Seaport so far? Well, we don't have any under NxG, but if we're continuing our methodology with applying data analysis from Seaport-E as an indicator of what will take place on NxG, we've seen 8,252 subcontracts totaling $4.4 billion that have been performed on Seaport-E. Now, Booz Allen does account for more than double. They've generated close to $1.5 billion as a large contractor, probably subbing to other large. So they wouldn't qualify for those individual socioeconomic designations. But if you are a small business, that number at the top in terms of $4.4 billion that has flowed through to subcontractors is a pretty appealing number and should pique your interest in reaching out to some of these largest to establish a partnership as a subcontractor. And with that, we were, by design, hoping to have about 15 minutes of the balance of the presentation for Q&A. So with that, we've got a few that we will turn to now. I'll read them aloud and then respond to as many as possible. The first question is, Seaport-E allowed users to access previously awarded performance work statements and task orders. How can a user do that in the NxG portal? This is a fantastic question because the way it is worded is Seaport-E allowed users to access previously awarded PWS statements. They not only allowed you to, but they wrote it in the original Seaport requirements. So if you are a contractor, you were required in the bylines of the contract to share your performance work statement. Bloomberg Government has ingested all of these, so if you are a client, you can very easily access those statements of work. We've got all of them featured in our contracts intelligence tool. Unfortunately, I do not think that same requirement was included in NxG. I'll have to take a closer look at the terms and conditions to verify this question with certainty, but I do not think the Navy this time around required companies to post their performance work statements. That's an excellent question, though. Performance work statements are a terrific indicator about the type of requirements that the Navy is purchasing and should be used to your advantage. We got a question about our emphasis on OASIS and professional services. We chose to focus on those because of the significance that they will have on activity in the future longevity of Seaport-NxG. So those are two vehicles managed by the General Services Administration and could interfere with the sustained progress that we're seeing go through NxG. So if there is any single most important vehicle stealing orders away from NxG, it is almost certainly going to come from OASIS and professional services, as well as some of the Army activity through RS3. We got a question on the large business slide. On the left-hand side, I will confirm, yes, that left pane was large business. Just to clarify for any of the data geeks out there, that is a filter by contracting officers' determination of business size. So that chart that we showed, the top 20 for large and small, that is derived from the contracting officer's determination of business size and is showing about 10 billion going to large, 3 billion to small. In slide 8, we had a question about what we were talking about. Volatility is pronounced similar to contracts.
Yeah, basically what we wanted to show there about the volatility was that you know, there's more play as to who's on the top on these kinds of contracts. Things tend to move around more. You know, in some other big contracts we've seen, there's a lot of stability. The same companies tend to dominate and stay in the same positions year to year. Seaport, things tend to move around a bit more. Again, just indicating the flexibility, the real openness sort of overall of this contract.
Yeah, I think it's not uncommon that the largest contractor would be intact year over year. So the point that we were trying to make with the volatility is that it's not necessarily the case that we are seeing with Seaport-E. Year over year, even within the top 5, we see some ups and downs company to company. And then if we expound that to the top 20 or so, there's even more fluctuation. So a spot in the top 21 year doesn't necessarily a certainty in the next fiscal year. We had a question on the requirements that are under Seaport-E and whether they allow for any hardware equipment purchases. So technically, the order cannot be placed for hardware and equipment purchases. It is supposed to be purely for professional services, but there is some room to allow for the ancillary services. So if it's oversight and management of an IT system and there's a component for IT hardware included in that, it is technically allowed. But if I'm looking at finding a vehicle that is most closely related towards delivering those hardware and equipment items, I would not say Seaport-E is the host for that. Most of that activity will go through vehicles such as NGen and some of those larger vehicles that are specifically designed for hardware installation. Again, we had a question. I thought that NAVAIR is not using SeaPort-NxG, and that's really why we included the slide in the first place, because to be honest with you, so did I. I didn't think that there would be as much activity in fiscal 2019 as we are seeing through Seaport. Now, a lot of that is likely the result of orders that were placed before and obligations that are now being reported. So it is a trend that we will certainly continue to monitor and see how it plays out. But overall, I was surprised at the biggest takeaway that there was a pretty decent amount of activity that was going through Seaport at NAVAIR currently. We've got about 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to our counterparts from Unanet. But a couple more questions before we do.
Again, somebody asked, do we need to have any Navy or Seaport-E business in order to participate in NextGen? You don't need to have Seaport-E business to participate in NextGen, but you do need to have some Navy business. As Dan said, I think indirect support of the Navy, but that can include subcontracting work as well. So you do have to have some Navy business, but not necessarily business that was Seaport-E.
Correct. And that can come in any variation. They are lenient on how they are applying that, and subcontract work would qualify. And it doesn't matter the order amount. If there's work that you can show indirect support of the Navy, you are qualified. We got a question on the off-ramp. I know we spoke at length about the on-ramp. What is the time frame for an off-ramp? There is no time frame that has been established by the Navy, but they, at any time, can call an off-ramp and remove companies based on the terms and conditions of the NxG contracts. And we have multiple questions as I was sifting through on the copy of the slides. Just as a reminder, we will send those out to all participants. And with that, I will turn it over to our co-presenter, Richard Hayden, to speak briefly about some of the Unanet offerings.
Great, thank you. This has been a fantastic topic, and we're delighted to support it. Bloomberg Government has provided market insights at our annual user conference for a number of years, and the information has always been really well received by the attendees. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Unanet, we provide ERP software for professional services firms, and it so happens that several hundred Unanet customers are awardees on SeaPort-NxG. This picture here has a lot in it, but it illustrates the breadth of capability that's brought together in an integrated approach to ERP software. People often think of ERP as accounting, and it provides only a view looking backward, but kind of like looking back through the rearview mirror in a car. But there really is a potential for so much more. Taking the kind of market intelligence that's being shared today at the front end, feeding into the opportunity pipeline, and informing the rest of the business can be incredibly compelling. Our customers talk to us about this a lot, and they talk about the integration of pipeline forecasting, taking into account win probabilities, along with capacity, resource planning, program management, work assignments, billing, financial reporting. All these things together deliver many benefits, such as easier compliance with foreign CAS, lower G&A, as well as real-time visibility into important metrics like backlog and project margin. So all I really wanted to highlight is there's a real source of competitive advantage for professional services firms in integrating these functions. And so having said that, thank you, and back to you, Dan and Robert.
Thank you very much, Richard. That will conclude the presentation today. With that, I will thank Unanet for inviting Bloomberg and participating with us today. Thank you, Rob, for participating. Thank you to our audience members for listening. We encourage you to contact us with any information or questions. Our contact information is included on the back. Thanks again, and we wish you the best of luck competing on Seaport moving forward.